August 16th, now 5 p.m. I'll call the meeting to order. We've got the agenda before you. Councillor Gulson.
I'll move the agenda presented.
Thank you. Any with any changes or additions? All those in favor? So carried, thank you. And I understand that we have some individuals who are presenting. Obviously, that will be electronic, I assume.
Yes, that was correct.
Very good. So we'll start in then with item 3.1, our economic analysis update from Hobson Chahal Advisory Group. And I believe that they are here on behalf of CIBC. Is this correct? Very good. So James Hobson and Greg Chahal, welcome. Who will be leading the presentation?
So Chart, you'll share your screen if that's possible.
Yep.
Very good. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everyone, and good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, good evening. So just by way of introduction, Chart and I have been managing the city's investment portfolio for a little over a year and a half now. It's nice to finally get in front of council and give you an update. We wanted to give you sort of a quick summary, because obviously we've been through a very volatile period here. Chart and I do economic updates across the province very frequently for councils, and the question is coming up a lot is sort of what happens from here, right? What's next? So we've titled this presentation, What's to Expect from the Recovery's Next Wave. So I'll just jump straight into it. So this chart here just shows you Canada's real GDP. The red line is what's actually happened, and the gray line is what's forecast going forward. So you can see just how intense that drawdown was, in early 2020 last year from the COVID lockdowns. No surprise to any of us. The second wave is circled there. There was not that much of an impact from the second wave. A lot of that was because things were reopening while that was happening, and we weren't seeing that sort of strict lockdowns like we saw in the first wave. Now, the third wave is what we haven't seen the data on, and we'd expect it actually to be a bit worse, than the second wave, and we're going to explain why going forward. So the main thing to look at here is when we break down Canada's economy as a whole into which sectors were actually impacted by the most by the pandemic. The sectors that did the best are on the left there, things like wholesale, insurance, real estate, the service industry, which contributes about a quarter of all of the GDP of the country. Now, so it's a large share of the GDP, but it only employs about 10% of the total population. So relatively labor, so there's not much labor required to generate that GDP. Whereas on the right, it shows you the worst performing sectors. Not surprisingly, it's the hospitality industry, food services, entertainment, arts, things like that. They only make up 5% of the economy, which you might think that's not a big deal, but they employ 15% of the population. So the impact to jobs has been pretty significant. Now, Chart and I have shown this graph quite a bit to administration over the past year now. On the left there, it shows you just that Canadians are sitting on sort of a record amount of cash. It might be surprising to learn that all of that fiscal stimulus that was doled out, a lot of people actually saved it or used it to pay down debt. On top of that, you had the whole situation where you couldn't go out to eat, you couldn't travel. So there was a lot of sort of pent up cash that people have on the sidelines. So we're sitting on a record amount of cash, which is impacting the short-term interest rates that the city can get on its cash balances. Now, the theory here is that to sort of fuel this next stage in the recovery, that cash is going to be unleashed on the economy. If you've been to the airport recently, I just flew in from Toronto yesterday. The lineups are insane. Everybody is trying to travel. They haven't traveled for a while, so a lot of spending on on hospitality, going out to eat, travel, things like that. So on the right, we would expect sort of the changes in spending for the next half of the year relative to the first half of the year to go towards services, the bar on the left. So and then the goods sector, which has been leading the economy so far, to sort of take a back seat. So it's going to rely heavily on sort of how we can keep things open. There's been a lot of concern, obviously, about the Delta variant, so that will certainly come into effect. However, our forecast would have been stronger if the Delta variant hadn't come up. But our forecast is still for growth, and we'll give you those numbers in a minute here. Now, this just shows you, so the US is kind of a leading indicator for us. They tend to be sort of 6 months ahead in terms of their growth, inflation, interest rates, all of those indicators. So all this is showing you is the blue line is the pre-pandemic growth trend. So if the pandemic never happened, that's where you would kind of expect to see GDP to be between 2019 and 2023. Now, the gray is obviously what's happened. The black is sort of where economists were forecasting growth to be in January. Now, the key thing to notice here is that in January, economists did not see growth getting back or recovering to pre-pandemic levels, even by 2023. We would still be below those levels. Now, fast forward to today, the consensus for the US at least is that GDP will actually not only recover to 2019 levels, but actually overshoot. So we'll be running at a pace that's actually hotter than we would have expected from 2019. Now, there's a lot of factors that come into play. Obviously, we've seen tremendous fiscal stimulus on both sides of the border here, North America. We've seen monetary policy extremely loose, and we expect that to stay the case for some time now. And then with this reopenings and all of this cash on the sidelines, you're starting to see the impact of that. So the overall forecast for the first time in a while, Chart and I do a lot of these economic updates. So first time in a while, it's actually a good news story that we're bringing to you today. Now, we get a lot of questions, just shifting gears here, about inflation. Now, you might hear sort of the headline inflation numbers. They sound a bit scary because they're starting to run above the central bank's 2% target. So what we like to do is actually just break down the components of inflation. So when you strip out those COVID sensitive items, which is that red line there, those items are going, you know, the supply chain issues, soaring commodity prices, they've pushed that headline inflation number up quite a bit. But if we strip that out, those COVID sensitive items, what we end up with is an inflation number that's right around the central bank's target of 2%. So, which is why you're seeing central bankers come out and say, we don't need to raise interest rates yet. We don't foresee inflation persisting this high. We just see it as a temporary overshoot. So that's why we'll see, in Chart, we'll get into this, why the central bank should keep monetary policy loose for the foreseeable future. One thing so Chart and I work with 55 municipalities across Canada, most in Alberta, and a big question we're getting, it comes up a lot, is wage inflation. So this is certainly something to watch, and you're already starting to see it in the news, and this kind of just illustrates from one sector why this is starting to become a factor. So the left there shows you what happened in the US when restaurants reopened. The sales in restaurants spiked materially above, as you would expect, the general trend line for the long term, as people came out to eat, started to spend their money on restaurants. And not surprisingly, on the right shows you the average sort of hourly wage that you would have to pay for leisure and hospitality. And it's already started to not only catch up to, but exceed the pre-COVID sort of trend line. So one big thing to watch here is that we're starting to see, if you watch the news, restaurants are unable to find qualified workers. It's becoming more difficult to attract and retain good talent. And obviously, wages are a big component of municipalities' annual budget. And that's something certainly to watch over the coming year or so. And just to kind of show the other side of the coin here, one thing that has been a big trend is that income support, so all of those checks that were sent out to individuals throughout the last year and a half, CERB and whatnot. The countries with the doled out more, you're starting to see those people who are getting those checks choose to stay out of the labor force. They would rather, you know, collect the CERB check than try and look for a job. So the theory here is, as we see that fiscal stimulus start to withdraw, which we are seeing, you should see more people enter the labor force, which will offset that sort of supply issue on the labor front. But it's going to be interesting to see sort of which force on the supply demand of labor is going to cause that wage inflation. I guess this, if you're going to take anything from this presentation, this might be the slide. So Alberta could see the biggest economic overshoot versus budget expectations of any province in the country. So this just shows you the budget from the province back in 2019 for change in GDP from 19 to 2022. And you can see the gray bar is what the province forecasted. Pretty tepid growth, sort of 2% over that 2-year period. But the red line is our economics team's forecast, which is materially higher, so more than 10 percentage points higher over that period. So you're going to what you should expect to see is economic overshoot, or growth start to exceed expectations, which should help provincial budgets, all of that, you know, job creation, all of those good things that we want to see. Another thing, if we break down employment, not surprisingly, this just shows you the red bar is the change in sort of the retail, restaurants, personal services sectors. Not surprisingly, across the country, those have taken a hit as tourism has dried up or had dried up. And the gray bar is the change in all other industries. So you'll notice that Alberta is second from the left. There's no gray bar. And the reason for that is there's been no change in overall employment for all other sectors in Alberta besides that sort of retail and hospitality industry. And one thing that we're paying close attention to is the job vacancy rate. Now, you would sort of expect us to be in a situation where there weren't enough jobs out there available, but this just shows you, so Alberta, again, second from the left, the gray bar is what the job vacancy rate is in 2021, and the red bar is what it is now. So there's actually more jobs available than there are people to fill those jobs, which again is sort of fueling that wage inflation that we're starting to see here. I'll turn it over to Chart and he'll wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, James. So one thing that even from beyond an economic standpoint, it's in Alberta that we can finally see is these, we've seen oil kind of go mid-high 70s, now coming back to about 67.25, and then I think gas today around 394 and change. So a really positive news story for commodities in general. A couple of questions we get is why, and obviously COVID was brutal, right? There's no way around that. From an economics perspective, COVID has been absolutely brutal. It's devastating global economies around the world. However, the one silver lining that anybody can kind of take away from, specifically here in Alberta, is that what COVID ended up being is the catalyst that any commodities that were struggling, or any commodities in general, needed to kind of get out of a glut that was, whether it was a supply glut or a demand issue. It kind of rebalanced and reshifted the fundamentals in quite a few ways. And I'll try and I'll give you my Coles notes, essentially what essentially precipitated that. So from a supply perspective, what obviously caused the first crash, nobody needs to be retold here, was a supply issue in the States, U.S. shale oil, far too much of it, and limited capacity getting pipelines out, which essentially killed the crude oil market for quite some time. Now, what COVID essentially did is, when obviously everything kind of shut off, well, we actually did see U.S. shale bankruptcies, and so we actually saw production come offline. But the difference between this production coming offline and the previous crashes is this is permanent production that's come offline, and it's not going to be coming back. One of the primary factors for that is these aren't large mega companies. These are a lot of mom and pop junior oil and gas companies. And what COVID did is it forced U.S. financial institutions to change their risk appetite and their risk profile. And so they're not even lending for these guys anymore. So that's permanent production that's come offline on the supply side. On the demand side of the coin, what we've essentially had everybody do is, as James kind of pointed out, we've seen unprecedented amount of fiscal stimulus we've ever seen pushed out in the economies. Well, what that essentially does is, if I use an elastic band analogy, is you just pulling back on the elastic band further and further and further and further and further, creating the increased potential so that as soon as an economy is ready to open back up, a lot of these inputs like crude and natural gas and other commodities are ready to rebound. So that you'll hear words in the market and in the market and the news, things like commodity super cycles. And that's what we kind of entered into right now. That will be why, and that's why the forecast has shifted. And that's why you'll see the biggest, James was talking about, the biggest provincial budget overshoot would be Alberta, is because Alberta could not have foreseen the perfect storm or catalyst to reshift the supply-demand balance within our province on such a short scale. So that would be why you would see the biggest kind of overshoot from that perspective. And the other good side here is on the right-hand side, Alberta's kind of budget back in 2019 versus the budget in 2021. You can actually see them actually starting to loosen the wallets a little bit. If we actually adjust for COVID spending, you can actually see there's going to be about a 4% increase in budgetary spending versus what we saw in 2019. So even with the overshoot, it lets them loosen up the purse a little bit and kind of push the money back into the economy, which has definitely been needed for across. Yes, we are COVID. COVID has been great for our province, but we still have unemployment. We still have it's still a service sector recession. We still have service level workers in Alberta, and so they definitely need the support as well. Now, this slide, what this essentially shows you is how we're stacking up all the way from every province and then within Canada. 2020, like I said, brutal. Close your eyes. It's a write-off year from a GDP perspective. Canada, 5.3%. Alberta, 8.2% negative in 2020. The key things to look at here in 2021 and 2022, obviously Canada at 5.7% and 4.3%. Alberta, for the first time in a long time, and it's been a very long time since I could say this, is going to lead all the other provinces in GDP growth. And it's actually a good positive news cycle and positive news story. Previously, we used to show that Alberta would be forecasting to lead other provinces, but I always like to use the analogy, and James heard this one quite a bit for myself, that if you fall down a well and you come out halfway out of a well, you're still, that's 50% growth, but you're still in a well. Now it's happy to report that we're actually out of there. We're actually getting positive new fundamental growth going forward. So Alberta leading for the next couple of years, strongly driven by our commodity prices and our commodity sector as well. And this kind of shows you what that's essentially done. We've seen it. If anybody, well, obviously it's hard to travel to the U.S. now, but if you have a U.S. in portfolios or you're looking to do any U.S. travel, we've seen what that commodity price surge has done to the Canadian dollar. That Canadian dollar has rallied significantly, and commodities have essentially been our safe haven, which is funny to point out because here in Alberta, we've essentially been the whipping boy for being commodity driven for quite some time and being diversified. But now it's the biggest savior, one of the biggest saviors for our economy, specifically in Canada, through the COVID pandemic. So very interesting cycle, and that's from a Canadian dollar's perspective. Now, I'm going to shift gears back to interest rates. I'll talk a little bit more about this. From a crude oil perspective and a commodity perspective, I'll just touch based on where we kind of see it going from now on. Anybody that's grown up in Alberta knows it's a boom bust cycle. It's when commodities rally, don't rally and keep rallying forever, and you don't have commodity year over year change that is strong that's going to stay there for a long time. So this chart kind of shows you that boom bust cycle for quite some time. The only thing I will say that I can put a little bit of caveat in, the bust won't be as hard this time, and that is because this has been a very strong and long drawn out recovery within the global markets. So what that tells us is a fundamental repricing and reshift in the commodity markets out there, specifically when you're talking about things like crude oil, natural gas. So what that tells us is it's a fundamental and it's a well-supported price that we're sitting around. I always like to say anywhere between 65 and 75, we're happy with that price. It's positive netbacks. Can we see $100 oil? We absolutely could. If the fundamentals and the forecast that persist right now, they're in the market, continue, we could see it push back up there. But the supportive commodity prices that globally everybody wants to see, whether you're on this side of the pond or across the pond and you're dealing with guys like OPEC, they want to see it around 65, 75 as well, so they can do capital budgeting projects and stable cash flows. That's things to look for. So the commodity super cycle won't last for long, but it is a fundamental repricing. Now, shifting gears to interest rates, James kind of touched on it. 2 years ago, interest rates were pretty low. We didn't think they were going to go even lower, but then lo and behold, COVID happened and everybody started cutting interest rates. You cut interest rates absolutely so low, and then cash gets hoarded, as James kind of pushed onto that slide. What essentially happens when things like that happen is lending appetites dry up, right? You have nobody doing any capital budgeting, no large scale debt projects. So when lending dries up, all financial institutions can essentially do is take these deposits and lend it back to the Bank of Canada at the overnight rate of 0.25. And that's exactly what we saw happen at the beginning of the year in January and February, where we saw, you would have seen it on short-term deposits, cash bank accounts, whether it was the municipality or personal bank accounts. You saw saving accounts rates plummet overnight, and that would have been the catalyst and the precipitation as to why. Now, the question is where we go from here. Where do we think interest rates are going to go from here? Obviously, lower for longer was always the call, but we can't be this low for that long. So when do we think that the Bank of Canada is going to raise rates? There's two ways to look at it. One is to just cheat and wait for the U.S. If you ever want to know when the Bank of Canada is going to raise interest rates, wait for the U.S. to do it and put a 6-month delay on it, and we'll probably be right there. And the main reason for that is, if everybody remembers that the last time the Bank of Canada raised interest rates before the U.S. Feds, we all remember when the U.S. dollar went to par. And that's exactly what happens if we raise interest rates too fast. Essentially, the currency gets even stronger than it already is, especially with a commodity-driven rally. If the dollar goes to par, our exports get absolutely hammered. So the Bank of Canada is very smart. They're looking at these numbers, and it likes to trade in that 70 cent and 80 cent dollar range to make sure that that essentially our dollar doesn't get so expensive that it kills our exports, but they also want to get it too cheap to hurt the impact of our imports as well. So they want to keep it floating within that fundamental, essentially, band from a currency perspective. So that's one way to kind of take a look at it. And the other reason we kind of look at the Bank of Canada as taking a very cautionary approach to hiking interest rates is the impact that a rise in the effective interest rate would have for not even like commercially or from a corporate perspective, but from individuals. What you're looking at on the left here is the effective interest rate on household debt. Obviously, for the last 20 years, it's been trending down for a very long time, and it's kind of sitting there lower for longer. So effective interest rates on household debt has been coming down. On the right-hand side there, you're effectively seeing the impact on consumer spending that every 1% change in the interest rate that households can have. And obviously, it makes sense that every dollar, the cheaper debt is, the more you can spend on consumer spending. But it kind of shows you that the impact is actually quite high. So the Bank of Canada is looking at numbers like this, and they know that if they raise it too fast, they can stifle out consumer spending. They can actually beat up GDP a lot faster than they intend to. So this is another piece and another forecasting tool that we can utilize to look at, okay, why do we know they're going to take a cautionary approach going forward? Our economist forecast right now is probably Q3 at the earliest for the Bank of Canada to start raising interest rates. And that obviously means that the US is going to be raising probably the quarter before that. Q2, Q3 is when the US Feds are forecasted to raise interest rates, and then we won't be far behind from that perspective. And just kind of on the US side, James talked on this a little bit, I'll go into as well. So PCE, this is another way of looking at inflation. So I want to talk about the core inflation that James is kind of touching on, specifically within the US labor market, right? Because as James said, wages inflation is going to be very, very important to watch for going forward. But when do we think it's going to change? And that's kind of what we're looking at here. On the right-hand side here is the number of unemployed persons per job opening. So the gray line is using headline unemployment rates. So that's the number you would see on the news. This is how many people, you want to think of this as a job capacity perspective, how many people are available in the workforce looking for jobs. So if you look at it from the news perspective, hey, it looks really good. But if we actually adjust it for that misclassification of the labor force, so that what that means is people no longer looking for jobs. And why it's really important, specifically in today's economy, to adjust for that is exactly what James just finished talking about, that wage subsidy and the impact of that wage subsidy. These people are rather sitting at home collecting benefits rather than going out and looking for an employment. This actually kind of shows us that. So what these two charts are kind of essentially showing you is that okay, inflation may be on par. The U.S. labor market is actually tighter than is reported in the news at first glance. But going forward, when do we think it's actually going to start? We're going to see those actual meaningful gains. And the long and short and quick summary version of it is when we see the U.S. Feds and the Bank of Canada start to cut those benefits, unemployment benefits, because you can kind of see as a proportion of the population, it has a very large impact. So as a proportion of the population in the labor force, you want to make sure that you're cutting back these unemployment benefits, and that will be the catalyst for getting people back to work when they no longer have to. We know essentially not competing against, as private sector or public sector, no longer competing against unemployment benefits to get people back to work, because the unintended consequence of that, as we now know, is wage inflation, which is a very, very large killer for small businesses. Now, putting everything we said in a very short time frame together for you guys, this next recovery, the overall from the COVID, the recovery is going to be fuller and faster than those seen from previous recessions. The primary reason, it's a service sector recession. This isn't a brick and mortar. We have to build manufacturing industries or build shops or anything like that. It's just getting service sector workers back to work. So a lot of dry powder sitting on the side. And from a capacity and dry powder's perspective, households have a lot of disposable income saved and ready to spend. The term we always use is that everybody's willing to die to go on a vacation. We're just not willing to die to go on a vacation. So once the economy starts to open back up, you have a lot of people sitting on the sidelines with a significant amount of cash and disposable income that they're ready to spend. They just need somewhere to allocate those dollars to. From on the Canadian side, and more so on the U.S. side, the return in demand is going to cause some inflationary pressures. You're already seeing that in the news. The one to watch, the silent killer that nobody ever reports on, is going to be wage inflation. And then from the interest rate perspective, I just touched on that. The Canadian dollar is going to probably weaken a little bit, give back some of its strength, and we'll probably see that the U.S. Feds will hike interest rates kind of mid to early next year, and then Canada a little bit later after that, probably Q3, Q4 is when we're looking at it. And then the unknown that every economist, every portfolio manager, anybody essentially right now is looking at is a new Delta variant, or whatever new variants, Lambda, Delta, you name, whatever they're calling them these days. We're all watching them to see how not necessarily what it's going to do to the economy. Are we going to go in another lockdown and things like that? The economists are essentially calling for this as a roll from a pandemic to an endemic. So it's not essentially going to leave us. It's just learning to live with it. And so as we kind of get desensitized, as James showed you in the very first chart, where we saw the economy just kind of fall off in basically a V-shaped recovery, we're now starting to see the long-term effects that the variants are having on our economy. And us as economists and portfolio managers, we're kind of looking to see what that kind of looks like and what the new norm essentially is going to be going forward. So that's from an economics perspective. I'll give you a really quick update on your guys' portfolio and the portfolio performance over the last year and a half. If in March or April you told us last year that we're going to finish 2020 with a positive number, we'd have been very surprised. But we were very happy to report, given a strong resource that you guys have with the administration, great communication that we've had with administration as well, we've been able to kind of pivot the portfolio and adjust for market expectations. So we finished 2020 with a very strong year of 7.1%. And year to date, we're up about 1.2%. And with inflation on the rise, you would see bond portfolios essentially flat to negative right now. But again, because we've been able to be pretty nimble and capture crystallize gains earlier than expected, we've actually been able to push in quite a bit of positive return into the portfolio already. And this is all with principal guaranteed investments that are fully compliant with the Municipal Government Act. So fully principal guaranteed, very safe investments that are performing very, very strongly from a rate of return perspective. And with that, I will pass it over to you guys for questions.
Thank you very much. Certainly a lot of information to absorb. Who has questions? Councilor Ross.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So, approximately, what's your expectations for inflation for going into 2022, 2023, and so forth with what's occurring currently?
The cheat sheet for inflation, if you ask any economist, what's your long-term inflation expectation, they're always going to say a standard 2%. But it depends largely on, as James was kind of touching on, those COVID sensitive items. So we've seen north of 3%. we need to see that kind of shake off. We need to see supply chains adjust before we see that normalization come down. You may see some of those north of 3% headline numbers kind of persist for a little bit until supply chain bottlenecks can kind of get figured out. And then you'll see it kind of level off in terms of actually hitting that economist target of 2%. So you'll see a little bit of a spike, but it's going to take some time to get there. We all remember gas. Well, last year gas was 60 cents, so year over year it looks terrible, but the matter we were just not driving anywhere, right? So if you actually strip out those numbers, we're kind of in line with the 2%. It's just making sure we adjust for these COVID sensitive, or another way to think about it is commodity inflationary numbers that are in the reported headline number that you would see on the news.
So with respect to our own city portfolio and a reasonable expectation by the end of the year, we're basically going to match that 2.5%. Would that be a reasonable expectation
I think so.
to be slightly ahead of inflation?
That would be our goal, yeah. So obviously we're restricted by the MGA to only buy principal guaranteed investments. You know, we're annualizing in that 2.5% range right now. I think given the environment we've been through, where rates have actually come up in the bond market, we would be happy with that. Do not peg us to 7% last year, because there was a lot of factors that we had in our favor in terms of crystallizing excess capital gains. What we can say is the longer we have these bonds invested, the more opportunities we'll have to get rates of return that are above the rate of inflation. So our goal would be to not only sort of hit the match of inflation or the rate of inflation, but also exceed it. We have some tools that we use that are specifically for municipalities that generate yields right now as high as 3%. So, but yeah, the average yield on a bond portfolio right now, 2%, 2.5%, that's a reasonable expectation.
And just to put it in perspective then, from last year, over 7% in a non-government controlled atmosphere, which I'm assuming is all the two of you work in. But so some of your other colleagues then would have seen gains in what range?
If you'd own the equity market?
Yes.
So some of the tools that we use for the city are actually, we're able to tie a fully guaranteed investment to the equity market. So we did take advantage of, you know, back in April, May last year, adding some money to those tools that are up 9-10% in the last year. So to the extent we can leverage those returns, we will, but obviously we're not in the position to start throwing all our money in the broader equity market.
And just to add to that as well, what you'll notice about myself and James, it's very easy for us to pat ourselves on the back when we can show you 7%, but we always want to make sure we show you both sides of the coin. If we were to show you the equity market from March or April, the absolute bottom, those numbers would look like 20, 30% right now, but it's always dependent on when you've invested in the market. And to be honest, your guys' timing couldn't have been better last year, right? March and April was probably the perfect time to throw any money into any investment. I don't care what it was last year, when the market was trying to make sense of anything. So it's less of patting ourselves on the back. It's more so your guys' timing for making that decision at the right time.
Thank you. Councillor Hoekstra.
Thank you, Chrissy. I was wanting to relook at the slide on page 9 about Alberta has seen flat employment outside of hard hit services, that one. And yeah, that one. So when I look at that, like Alberta and Saskatchewan tend to be somewhat similar these days in terms of where our employment is. But I find this surprising that people in the energy sector, like that, it doesn't show some effect of what has happened in our energy sector. Or have we been misled? I guess that's what I'm curious about this, that it basically is saying status quo. And was it?
So according to all of our economics team, which they're smarter people than us, they do all the analysis on each individual province, all the sectors that contribute to those numbers. Alberta's been flat, believe it or not. We are a bit more diversified than Saskatchewan. They are very heavily commodity driven, as we are too. But our low tax rates have attracted other industries over the years, especially over the last 5 years, which have helped to offset that, right? So it's not just oil and gas that would contribute to those other sectors. It's other sectors like the tech sector that have been, and finance and insurance and real estate that have been booming to help kind of offset that, some of those losses that you saw in the oil and gas market.
And just to add to that from the oil and gas perspective, I wouldn't say necessarily that we've been misled, because absolutely there's been a recovery. We've had kind of a normalization, but it's more so in the sense that, like, from a profitability standpoint, and it's less about getting people back to work. It's just oil and gas companies found a really good way of being efficient, running really efficient balance sheets. And they're going to take a very cautionary approach kind of before they add any extra employment going forward, because yes, it's very easy to add like the service sector and like oil field services and on that side. But from the overall total employment perspective, we haven't seen the labor kind of pick up or the employment pick up from the commodity sector. So it has been a recovery, but the employment lag that's kind of coming with it hasn't kind of trickled through as of yet.
Councillor Gullickson.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I have a quick question regarding the changing environment for the workforce and the fact that a lot of people are working at home, and how is that going to affect the economies of these communities by these workforces? Like, for example, some of the people working in Lacombe, they don't live here anymore. They live elsewhere. And is that going to affect these municipalities in different ways, such as Calgary, where you go downtown and it's like a ghost town in certain areas?
It's going to have an effect, and I don't think I think we've seen an overcorrection one way, right? Because obviously COVID has forced that correction to kind of go, everybody's working permanent from home forever. No different than every industry. Our economists right now are calling for a correction, not all the way back to everybody button seats kind of model. It's kind of mirroring, I'll piggyback on the Big Four accounting firm hybrid models that they've essentially adopted going forward, where it's kind of remote work, but there's benefits to both sides of the coin. So right now, the impact isn't going to be a permanent impact where everybody's going to be able to work remote forever. The call is for some type of hybrid model. The banks, our CEO has called for some type of hybrid model. It's hard to predict what that is, because everybody right now is learning at the same time. We're all trying to figure out and adapt to what we need to. No different than City of Lacombe trying to figure out what to do with do we get everybody back to work? Do we offer some type of hybrid model as well? It's hard to kind of go, where do we think it's going to be? But we do know there's going to be a correction coming back. We've seen it in the States, where you get guys like JP Morgan and so on, kind of going, everybody button seats, get back to work. And you've seen some people on the other side where it's kind of going, okay, we're going to shed these expenses that are downtown expensive offices and get everybody back to work. But so it's largely dependent on kind of corporate policy and what everybody's individual kind of focus would be. It's less going to be about everybody has one way or the other. It's kind of all up to personal interpretation, essentially.
Does anyone else have any questions? Well, we certainly want to thank you both. I've heard positive input from our senior administration team that you gentlemen are certainly pleasant to work with and responsive to our needs. So thank you for that. We look forward to a presentation next year, only with much higher returns.
We'll do our best.
Very good. Thanks for your time.
Very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
There you are, Senior Manager McKinnon. Thank you. Item number 4 for reports to committee, the 2022 pre-budget talks, please.
Good evening, Mayor Creasy and Council. So this fall, Council is going to adopt a 2022 operating and 2022 capital budget, along with a 3-year operating plan and a 10-year capital budget. Today, I'm going to provide you some information for Council to decide what the 2022 budget target should be. I will start with the 21 approved budget targets, then highlight Council policies that relate to the budget directly, and then discuss potential changes in revenue expenses for 2022. Purpose of this committee meeting is for council to provide direction to administration on budget targets as well as the level property tax for 2022. The 2021 recap. In 2021, the city's operating budget, including transfers from reserves and internal charges, transfers was slightly over 43 million, as shown in the attached charts. The city's staffing levels have remained relatively stable. We have increased 2 FTEs from 2020 to 2021. One position was a custodian that was offset by savings for cleaning, and the other janitorial services. The other one was an intern position that became a permanent for the engineering technologies. The 2021 final approved capital budget is approximately $10 million. There are 4 council policies that tie into the budget presentation and preparation. The first policy is the annual budget and taxation policy, which was approved by council in 2018. Section 4B of the council adopted annual budget and taxation preparation policy states that the city shall use the July 1st Alberta CPI index as a targeted property tax increase. Now, the Alberta Consumer Price Index is an indicator of changes in consumer prices experienced. It is obtained by comparing over time the cost of fixed basket of goods and services purchased by consumers in Alberta. The June 2021 Alberta CPI is 2.7%. This means that on average, the goods purchased in June 2021 were 2.7% higher than the same goods purchased in June 2020. So excluding gross revenue, every 1% tax increase will generate approximately $150,000 in additional tax revenue. 2.7% tax increase is equivalent to $405,000 in additional tax revenue. The second policy is the compensation policy. The city's compensation policy outlines the city's philosophy for determining the annual cost of living adjustment and market adjustments for staff. The policy states that in salary survey years, on January 1st of the following year, the adjustment to salary ranges will consider both market analysis, market adjustment based on the survey results, and the cost of living analysis allowances. I'll mention the July 1st Alberta CPI. In 2021, a comparative salary survey was done for the municipal staff based on 11 comparable towns and cities. The third policy is the council remuneration and expense policy. The city's council remuneration expense policy outlines the city's philosophy for determining the compensation for members of council. Every election year, council remuneration is to be reviewed, with impacts happening the following year. The 2021 a comparative salary survey for the mayor and council was done in accordance with the council remuneration policy. Finally, the fourth policy that impacts budget is the debt management fiscal policy. In 2012, the council adopted a debt management fiscal policy. Section 4 of this policy limits the municipality to 75% of the debt limit established by the province through the MGA. Council also limits the debt servicing to 75% of the limit established by the provincial regulation through MGA. Finally, council's policy stipulates that the debt service cost for tax supported debt will not exceed 20% of the taxes available for municipal purposes. Currently, the city's debt stands at almost 60% of the municipal debt limit and 45% of the MGA limit. The city has 40% debt limit available or can borrow an additional $16 million and remain within the council policy. The debt servicing repayment of principal and interest is approximately $2 million per year right now. This is well within the $6.6 million limit by council policy. So there's still $4.6 million of debt servicing remaining before council limit is reached. The city is also well below the maximum debt servicing limit for tax supported operations of $3 million. Approximately $1.8 million of the current debt servicing is for tax supported services. In conclusion, the city is well within the debt and servicing limits of the MGA and the council's debt management policy. The long-term debt outstanding as of December 31st, 2020 is $25,841,769. Although the debt has gone up about 30 million or 30,000 in the last year, the interest rates of the newly acquired debt are substantially lower. So the servicing cost is pretty reasonable. Cost of borrowing also remains fairly affordable. The estimated cost of borrowing $1 million today would require repayment of principal and interest of about $53,946 per year for 25 years, or $48,241 per year for 30-year term. The 2022 budget risks include that the city of Lacombe is facing include anticipatory inflationary increases in goods and services, uncertainty of revenue meeting pre-COVID budget levels for the Lacombe Memorial Center, Gary Moe Auto Group Forest Plant, and Kinsman Aquatic Center. And the municipal sustainability initiative grant is also going to be reduced in the next 2 years and replaced with a new funding source, but we're not sure what that will look like. There's also asset deterioration due to deferred maintenance, rehab, or restoration that we need to be concerned about. And finally, the roads asset management plan indicated that a $4.3 million budget shortfall to maintain the current overall condition rating and support new growth for the next 10 years. Administration proposes to fund this deficit through a dedicated special paving tax. Administration recommends setting this tax equivalent to 1% of the general tax initially and increasing it by that amount annually. Now I will talk about the changes in the revenue and expenses from 2021 to 2022. In 2022, the estimated changes in revenue expenses include a $390,000 increase in revenue and a $1.2 million increase in expenses. The revenue change includes building permit, franchise fees, lease revenue, and increases to the special paving tax of 1% related to the road asset management. Expenditure change includes 20% increase in medical benefit coverage, increase in electricity, natural gas, insurance, software licenses, IT costs, and policing costs. There's also a suggested increase to the contribution to the reclamation and the roads reserves. The impact of adjusting the compensation of council staff have also been identified and included in the expenditure increase. The net expenditure increase, revenues minus expenses for 2022 is forecasted to be $830,000, or equivalent to 5.53 tax rate increase. The 5.53 tax rate increase exceeds council's adopted tax rate increase threshold of the Alberta CPI by 2.83%. One item that has not been finalized in the figures about is the new growth, which traditionally adds between $50,000 to $75,000 per year. Further franchise fees may also be have a different impact on revenues depending on the median rate and any council decisions related to the rate changes. In conclusion, the City of Lacombe's projected net expenditures are $830,000 higher than the 2021 net budget of $43 million. The net increase represents a 5.53% tax rate increase. Council's policy suggests an adopted tax rate of 2.7% for Alberta CPI as of July 1st, 2021. Therefore, the projected net expenditures exceed the suggested tax rate of about 2.83%, higher than the adopted policy. Tonight, administration seeks council direction on setting a budget target of tax rate increase to help us prepare for the 2022 operating and capital budget plans. I'm hoping to answer any questions.
Thank you, Senior Manager McGinn. Let's start. Councilor Ross, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Christie. I guess we'll start. The first one is medical benefits. Is that just as an increase because of wage band increases as number of years of level of service, or why 120,000?
There's a couple of reasons. Part of it due to COVID, in the fact that short-term disability really increased significantly. So short-term disability impacted us because when people were off sick with COVID, not when they were just postponed off COVID, that became short-term disability. So that actually increased because of that. Other increase, there was a lot of mental health consultations that went on last year with COVID. And it was also, I think, because people were working from home when they were able to go out and get massages and remedial type services, because despite the stress, people did actually seek out those assessments. So the experience that we've had, it's called an experience, but with the insurance company, increase to a point that it has actually been
So it's driven by numbers and statistics insurance, like, okay, that's an extreme year, like, could you not anticipate them to level off?
Negotiating with, service provider and suggesting that it was, an unusual year that had unusual characteristics to it. But I think we also are considering other options when it comes to short-term disability and looking at some of doing cost benefit analysis. I think we can find a more efficient way.
Sure, good, doesn't it?
Does the 95,000 for utilities costs, does that include the already arrangements with the provincial library for building changing?
There is a reduction of 35,000 in utilities. It's down a little bit lower.
Okay,
To offset some.
all right, thank you.
Councillor Goldson?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Regarding transportation services at $6 million, what does that include? What do it?
Transportation includes roads, common services, general engineering services, storm sewer, accessible transportation services, and the airport contributions.
So storm sewer isn't included in water and wastewater and water services then?
Potable water only.
That's possible.
Because those, excuse me, are utilities. The storm sewer is considered a portion of the road network. It's not funded using the utility rate model like water and sewer would be used. So it is classified as a part of the road. Majority of the storm sewer exists within the road, and that the major services use the road as not the storm service itself. So in storms above 1 in 5, it is intended that the city's roads would flood and provide overland conveyance. So they do form a part of the city's stormwater.
Thank you.
There's been some specific comments, I guess, is this overall or general term. I think that the 5.5% increase is going to be very unpalatable for people at home, which is understandable. So somehow we have to give some direction to the administration what number, if it differs from that. That will exist as to start out at a high number. It's always easy to increase than decrease, I would suggest. So I think that we need to give some direction as to where we would be, what would be a better range to be in. Councilor Ross?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. As previous council meeting information was brought forth, that we are 21% compared to the national average of 13%. And obviously, I'm assuming some of the downtown infrastructure that is considerably older than a few of us put together, that if that was taken care of, which obviously you're going to be dealing with some of the asset management of certain streets that could be improved at the same time. So I'm assuming that this increased contribution of roads reserve of that 1% is that 150,000. But with that percentage getting closer to the national average, wouldn't that service the reconstruction and identifying the water loss? How do we go about that direction? That mathematically could be a gain by identifying the water loss and yet still doing asset management improvements in certain streets that could be improved. So how do we mathematically find that balance that we maybe wouldn't be as, like obviously it's been brought forth to council, we're behind on sidewalk street improvements as per lifetime of the street. But yet, you follow what I'm trying to say? Sorry.
Absolutely, and I think that all of us would dearly love to be able to find out where those losses are being incurred, but I think to expect that to come about in a time frame that will have a positive impact on this budget is a little unrealistic. I think we've got given direction to administration to pursue several different options, a couple of which were identified and seen as fortunately not what we were after. But that process is ongoing. I just don't know that it's going to have a positive impact on this budget.
True, but I thought we were pursuing 3-year budgeting. Is that kind of a blend with, resolving some of this and more of a long-term thing? Like, sorry, I'm just kind of, I'm thinking numbers. How do you catch up with the road improvement, yet deal with a water loss that could long-term be a benefit? And, I'm trying to make a blend here, if that makes sense.
Chief Gotti?
One of the things that increased attention to the roads would offer, especially in the area you highlighted, for example, if you're able to redo more roads, that gives you the opportunity to look at the water and sewer at that same time. And if you have some of the older infrastructure in the older part of the town, just like you talked about, that's also where we see some of our lower road quality indexes. Now, some of them don't have high traffic, and so they're not necessarily going to rise to the top, but some of them are. You're going to get, the more roads you do, the more pipes you can do at the same time. Going in to just chase water or sewer problems is difficult without doing major road rehabilitations in the same. So I think that paying attention to the roads is going to give you an opportunity to also pay attention to the water and sewer. To target that lower loss point.
And specifically with speaking to that increase in the roads reserve, $150,000 that was identified, and that was over a fairly long period of time. So
Yes, so going back to the presentation from March, where Director Thompson highlighted the shortfall in roads reserve for the next 10 years of $4.5 million. The proposed funding methodology was to increase the fund, or was to implement a special payment tax that would start at 1% and increase 1% every year thereafter for the duration of the 10 years. At that point, the major road rehabilitation, some sort of remedial mitigation work, like 15% of the roads over the next 10 years. So that is going to give you that opportunity to look at some of your older infrastructure at the same time.
I guess that's the reason why I wanted to highlight that, because I want the public to fully appreciate the impact that it has. It's probably one of the single largest lake areas, I guess is the polite way to put it, that we have, is the condition of roadways, the associated infrastructure that goes with it. It's a significant cost, and that is the reason why infrastructure is let go as long as it possibly can, because it's an extremely expensive process to keep it up to a standard that we would all prefer. But when we break it down into real dollars, we're talking about that extra percent every year. This isn't just a one-time thing. This is each and every year increases in that amount. So it's a big impact. Councillor Jacobson.
Yeah, so two things. So to that point, so the relative tax increase to last year, 5.52%, we're going to actually be 6.52%, because there is additional 1% road tax being paid, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And that's each and every year after that, right? So it's not like it's 1% this year, but then next year relative to last year, it's going to be whatever that number is. It'll be three to that. Yeah, it'll be. Yeah, so I want to make, because I believe that number is a little bit misleading to the average taxpayer if it's an additional 1% on top of I mean, I'm in favor of doing it, it obviously has to be done. The other question I had was just, a few months ago, there was, a presentation to us on a different methodology of collecting toll tax revenue. And I want to make sure that this presentation here assumes that we are taking the tax rate and applying it to each household as opposed to dividing it.
It does, that is our methodology. However, as we note here, we have not included new growth, the potential impact of new growth. And so that does generate an additional 50 to 75, but we're not at a point where we're able to project that, or our assessors are able to project that yet.
But that will be the methodology for it's just statutory now, right?
That methodology is embedded in your tax preparation rules.
Councillor Hoekstra.
Thanks, Mayor Creasy. I mean, I have lots of questions, but I just need to follow up with Councillor Jacobson's question. So this 5.53 does not include the 1% for roads, you're saying?
Correct. That would be a special paving tax, which is levied under a different bylaw.
So this $150,000 that's realized at the top, you're still figuring it into the revenue though?
There's a corresponding increase in expenses for the contribution to the roads bill. So it's revenue neutral from that perspective, but it's not really revenue neutral. If you're the one paying, it's exactly, it has to be collected still. So yes, I agree with the viewpoint that really as a resident, I'm seeing 6.1 tax increase, although the municipal tax rate is only increasing by 5.5 per council.
For us.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I guess at these times, we've seen regular interest rates. Is there to a point that do we consider on for the capital? Like, there's a balance there. Like, obviously, interest rates are going to go up. It's seems kind of hypocritical. You would never want to take on more debt, but when is the best time to take it on is obviously when the interest rates are the lowest. Like, do you reevaluate our 10-year capital plan and do more of the downtown areas of concern of streets and sidewalks to, like, I'm getting back to the 21%. There's the savings in that. How much of that savings going up, we got down to 15% would service the debt of the road issue? Like, what percentage? Like, if we went from 21 to 15, there's 6%. The water going in and coming up, going out, and the difference. How much of that would service what amount of debt?
It's tough to predict it exactly, because if you had a reduction of 6% on the water, it's unknown what the corresponding reduction on the sewer. So if it was 100% that the leaking water was going into the sewer and the city was paying on both sides, then you could see between $150,000 and $100,000, I would say. But it really does depend on how much of that is leaking into the storm system versus how much of that is leaking into the sewer system, because the storm system actually is almost free when the city runs it, when there's no, there's no treatment, there's no overflow needed, which is run. But if it's going to the storm, actually the cost to treat that sewer is almost the same cost as to buy the water in the first place. So it's quite a variability, but it would be a significant amount of money that you could put into your utility reserves to combat that issue.
Because if you're talking $45,000, $50,000 per million, and all of a sudden you're at a high of $300,000, then that's a $6 million project that pays for itself. A loss. Why, if you find it, a lot of it. But
so one of the areas you could look at for taking advantage of low interest rates is consolidating some of your older loans that have higher interest rates to see if you can spread them out. Often there's fees associated with that. But I have seen other municipalities that have successfully lowered the annual operating costs through restructuring of the debt.
I would hope that management has looked at some of those items already.
We've looked at some of those things, but they require borrowing bylaws and significant restructuring. It's not magic. It's paying less per month for a longer period of time. So you don't actually lower the overall interest payment costs. However, given the lifespan of some municipal infrastructure, there's an argument to be made that actually extending it until it matches as closely as possible useful life of that asset does make a lot of sense. Actually, sort of like paying off a pipe quickly is not a good idea. You should spread it out over a period because many people can benefit from that. So to charge today's resident the whole cost of the pipe, when it might be a 75-year life, is really the best practice.
And certainly so that's the same theory that we've played with regional utilities as well. Useful life of the infrastructure. Fair enough. For us,
Sorry, Mayor Christine. So there were some services that were provided and I guess offset because of the closing of the arena, for example, the Parks and Rec Department provided services of clearing several sloughs that created a family environment in these COVID times that now if we don't do that because the same dollar value of Parks and Recreation operating is going to be focused back on the arena. And I think now we're going to have some citizens that would rather not see that service taken away, but yet it's an operating cost. Is, for example, is Parks and Recreation going to include in their budget to maintain that service, or are they going to go back to pre-COVID times, back to Parks and Rec focused on arena, swimming pool, curtain rings, so to speak, whatever, rather than, because I think a lot of families really appreciated all of this from Lake and every other area, you know.
So there is no provision for additional service levels within the Parks and Recreation Department. This budget has been proposed, depending on what the availability is. Depending on what restrictions are or not in place and the public's desire to use those facilities, there may or may not be extra capacity for things like arena staff. It's tough to know right now. But if it's operating at pre-COVID levels, I guess, there is a provision to offer those additional services such as the additional.
Councillor Olson.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Just following up on that, do we even know what the cost of extra cost was on that?
It's very tough
Yeah.
to calculate what the extra cost was. Because you don't track hours that way.
Yeah.
It's a specific like assets.
Yeah. So I mean, it's hard to say what it even cost us to do that, right? But anyway, I just find it, yeah, I don't think the tax increase would be palatable. I can't see, we're gonna have to find something in here to reduce that, some way of doing that. The 1% for paving tax. Now, just a clarification, I think I've got it right, that at the end of that term, it would be like 6-7% increase, is that right? Total, like how many years does it go?
I believe it's for a
10?
decade.
So it'd be like 12% increase at that point? Does it double every year? Goes one, that's
It
one.
doesn't double every year, it goes up 1%. Adds additional 1%.
So it's 150,000, then it goes to 300,000.
Roughly, I mean, there is growth.
Yeah, and then to 450,000 the following year. So 1% stays there also, right? So it keeps increasing 1% every year.
Yes,
For that period of time.
I mean, that's our proposed mechanism. resolving the shortfall. That it would require council's special payment tax works, is that the MD requires you to pass that as a special tax for the bylaw every year. So my time in government says that it wouldn't probably be so stepwise and predictable, that over time there would be shifting depending on the priorities of the day and what capacity is, but what we're proposing is start at 1%. So
And then by the end of that, it would be like 12% or more because it doubles on itself. Well, because if you're 150,000, if it's 1% based on the tax, it's still, would it not go up based on?
So year one, what we propose is that 1% of the general municipal requisition. Year two, it would be 2%, 3%, and so on for a period of 10 years. So that at the end of the 10-year capital plan, we have a special paving tax that would raise approximately $1.5 million a year. It would take the road network at the current. It's not.
So at the end, it would be a 12% or 10% increase that year.
It would be only a 1% increase from the year before. But if you were to compare 2021 to 2031, and you take the list of our recommended strategy, 10% that special payment. Now, once you're taxing at that level for a dedicated infrastructure cost by paving, I think it is likely in my mind that council's appetite for making additional contributions to the road reserve would diminish. But right now, you contribute the 220,000 traditionally every year to the road reserve. But if you're asking a special paving tax that's raised well in excess of that, I imagine that there would be a desire to lower the burden on the general tax rate that was associated with roads. It's sort of like, we're already doing that through special payment tax, but I got to tax people over here and over here. And so I think there's probably a small offset that happen over time. Maybe 1 or 2%.
I like the idea of a special tax like that. I just have a concern that when it's done, that it disappears. You know, or it has to go back and start over again. I don't know, when it's this typically for an item, when that gets done, it should be done.
Well, that would be nice in theory.
Yeah,
except that
I know it continues to.
By the end of that decade, you've got that much more infrastructure, which is deteriorating.
Exactly.
I mean, I agree with you,
Yeah.
it would be nice, but
It did, I know how that works, but every year we would have to pass a new bylaw.
That's correct.
Okay.
There's a legal requirement in the municipal government act. It states that municipalities only able to use the funds collected through special payment, or special tax of any kind, or the.
So that's specific.
Yeah, so like, it couldn't just be rolled into the municipal. Here we reached, and I'm sorry, we have talked to our maintenance staff. Focus on this issue. Sorry. Sorry, so if you pass it for a specific purpose and you reach a point where you're not able to reasonably justify that you need that money to maintain the roads, I guess that would be great because your roads will be in a condition that they don't require that kind of investment. Unfortunately, like
Never
there, I suspect you're always chasing that issue. And so you will need. But that is something.
So, yeah, because in every year it increases by $150,000.
That is
So
our
we-
proposal.
It'd be 150,000 and 300,000 for on an ongoing basis.
What's your loss?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So the $95,000, is that comparing pre-COVID and obviously during COVID, we had a significant number of shutdowns. So obviously utilities went down and now we're anticipating after COVID, is that to go back up to 95, or how do we, like 95,000 is very significant, also an increase, are we, that just comparing COVID time of the decrease of shutdowns, now we're back up, we're going back up to pre-COVID mean average, or what?
So I was just gonna say, it would be nice to know what the overall number is for these, so we can see if the top of it is significant. This is $95,000 increase for, our two most prominent utilities, electricity and natural gas. What kind of a number, a total number is that?
Wouldn't we address that by adjusting utility rate increases rather than being a overall, or is this?
I believe, I understood this to be utilities that are expended on city facilities.
That's correct. I don't have those numbers, perhaps City Manager McKinney can give us
I can just hold them up.
a total electricity and natural gas.
And my second question is, with the increase in insurance, software and IT, is that going to be an increase in average annual operating expenses that, like, through the year, or is this a one-time thing? Because,
Software licenses will not be a one-time thing.
no, that's what I mean. Is this an increase in average operating?
That is an annual increase, the IT support. I would like to say I expected short-lived, because there is some components of it that are there to serve specific project needs that are anticipated. But again, just looking at my experience in the last 5 years here, as your software and licensing costs and integration increases, you need to support those. That's most industries they're seeing. That is how you're getting efficiencies for the managers. That's the.
So with the increase in IT support, I'm just curious how this all fleshed out with the changes we've had in supporting the local police service. I think that most of this room would be anticipated perhaps a slight decrease. And now we're seeing an increase. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's too early.
A component of it is to support some of the services we're providing. So we do have a service level agreement. There's the final stages executed between the two straight organizations, wherein one of the city staff will be spending time cited at the police service site to provide some daily oversight and project management and support for this. I would say the majority of this IT support, though, really is for data analysis. Both as our staff need to move into other project management roles for things like the next Gen 911, it leaves us with less capacity to perform database analysis, data analysis. And that's where we're seeing some of our big problems come up. Water and sewer is not actually in the physical infrastructure are we able to see the problems, but often it appears to be a database data analysis issue. We're not able to analyze the data fast enough, quantify when there is an error, what is the source of the error. So we think actually talking about trying to target reductions in our water loss and corresponding this is what can happen. So I'd love to say it's all local food service, but that's really not true. Our needs for IT support internally and for local food service are increasing.
Just confusing a couple of things though. First one, the LPS, I thought they made a decision to after their own IT support. Is that not?
I know that did not.
Okay, all right, so that takes care of that one. The second one then would be, as far as the data analysis one on utilities, I guess just given our recent what was it, 300 accounts or so, that only resulted in 2 that were identified as really being a significant issue. Just wondering if this increase data analysis justify itself.
That's what we came to that very thing, was that actually the physical boots on the ground infrastructure has not shown itself to be an issue. We suspect that the larger issue is actually the integration between city software. Much as you would expect, given the number of municipalities out there to be some integrated solutions for these things, the difference in regulatory environments and size of municipalities has driven every municipality to have a suite of different databases and programs for managing those. So, and the permutations are infinite. And so it's kind of like, I try to explain it, that it's like, remember the sustained energy, where you have put together a factory using existing equipment, and it all needs to coordinate. None of it has been designed necessarily to coordinate. You need a whole time that's making sure each of these talks to the other as it should. That's what municipal software is. There's just so much out there and so much that needs to be managed that you aren't in the one best work. Expect that.
And I completely agree with that. I guess I'm just curious if there's areas where we can back out, because this never ever goes away. It only increases each and every year. This $40,000 increase in the licensing this one year, this is on an overall cost to the city. Do we have a rough idea what that might be?
What the licensing is?
Yes.
That it's a lot to do with Office 365. That is one of our software suites that we use within the organization. There is a plan that we're putting in place to have everybody move over to that suite. Right now, we have a bit of a hybrid of some people on an older licensing structure, and then we'll be moving them all to the Office 365 structure. There's a few other software within there as well, like Asana is included, which is our project management software that we've been integrating into the organization.
And just to be clear, I'm not questioning your choices that you made in this. I'm just wondering, is there areas where we've overreached in some of the software, and what is the overall cost of the software licensing per year to the city of Lacombe? Is this $40,000 increase on $100,000 or on $1 million?
I would have to come back to council.
I would say, you are seeing some of these costs, certainly, but a component of the cost is, look at that transfer of formerly capitalized every 5 years, we would buy software packages for the municipality to not go operational cost. You have to look at the corresponding, perhaps of this 40,000, I would say maybe 10,000 of it is related to things you're no longer capitalizing. Actually, those expenditures. It's a small.
That's all right. That's, I'll go to Ruben.
Didn't see it as Brenda.
Okay, my apologies. You gave us a building permit chart compared year by year. So at what point does for example, construction starts in January and it's at the start and it opens June or later, for example, okay, hypothetically behind a crossing credit, that will probably be completed within the next 3 months or going into 2022. So is then the building permits evaluated so that the estimated projection of that value is calculated, or 2022 of what started in 2021? If you understand what I'm trying to say.
It's very similar to the special paving tax. There's a portion of the municipal government act that allows municipalities to levy supplementary tax. So that is a special tax that we pass every year. And it does account for partial construction and attempts. Does a fairly good job, actually, to capture state different construction projects that are under development at different states of time. So, for example, yes, the city will realize some revenue this year.
That's part of the budget planning, because obviously that's going to create more revenue when it's completed. It's worth X amount of assessment dollars.
Sure. So typically we see between $50,000 and $75,000 supplementary taxes and the road. And that's not in the budget period. That's one of the things that is going to let. I suspect that if we went into budget today, but I suspect there are factors that will result in lower than 5.5% budget at the end of the day, such as franchise. But at this stage, our best estimates are level targeted tax rate.
Thanks for clarifying.
Thank you, Mayor Christie. My apologies, I may have missed this discussion. I knew that supper was going to sit well with me, so I had to leave it for a minute. So the medical benefits, the 20% increase. What kind of count? Like, why is that such a dramatic? Sorry.
We did talk about it, but the largest driver of that is the use of short-term disability. So this is short-term disability experience, which is what allows our insurance to set the rates and next year. See, the base, I'm actually. All this. Portion of it is to do with COVID-related sicknesses, but the majority is actually mental health. Mental health is a workplace issue that has been increased use of short-term disability. Very much. So this is experience rate.
Yeah, again, my apologies.
Can I add to that? Sorry? Can I add to that? So 50 was actually just, I've got the report here. 50, our experience went up in short-term disability about 132% in the past year. And so that is the biggest thing. We are, like, when we say it's going to go by 20%, there is going to be some serious negotiation where we are also going out to market again next year. They'll be looking to drive down that cost. And then we are looking at other options instead of doing short-term disability the way it is now. We are looking at other options to try and make that more beneficial.
Okay, thank you. As for my other thoughts on this, I do agree that the 1% increase for roads, that special paving tax, I just said to my wife the other day, we went up and down to Edmonton quite a bit. And that Highway 2 is a gong show. Keep telling her, I wish they would put that 3-lane in. They said if every Alberta paid $20 extra a year for the next 10 years, maybe we can get it done. But I'd be willing to do that because that's such a miserable highway. It's so busy. But anyways, so I when I saw this, I thought, okay, yeah, we have that within our own community. If we don't do something, we're going to get declined on this. So I think I'm behind that. As for the overall tax increase, it's significant. But again, I've seen this before in my time on council where and I'm just guilty of it, or anyone, I supported the 1% 2019 and the 0.8 last year, but it's not sustainable. After a while, there's a correction. Fortunately, maybe this year is the correction. I guess it's just we all want to keep taxes low, and we want to do what we can for our citizens to do that. But at the end of the day, if we don't keep it a measure, at least do it 2% every year, this is what happens. We get bit in the butt, and I'm as guilty as anyone proving those numbers. So I don't know what the final number needs to be. I know a lot of this has to do with the 2.7% COLA. But obviously we need a significant correction of what that number is. I don't know if you guys talked about the number or not. My only question is, for the police cost increase, I have different numbers, but the 145, is that the COLA as well, and within that number?
Yes, so the 145, we didn't have finalized numbers, and I believe actually you're still just the timing. We didn't have finalized numbers from the police service as to what their anticipated additional transfer would be. So we estimated it 1% using a combination of CPI and so that was an estimate placeholder. I actually did meet with Chief Pegg last week. I believe that is actually very similar to what they're.
Yeah, actually, my number's a little higher anyways. Just so everyone knows, of the 145, 75,000 is wage and COLA. So just, I don't want anyone thinking there's no new positions or anything like that, but again, so it's significant in that line because of COLA as well, and the new collective bargaining agreement with the members. So just so we're aware that 75,000 of that is part of it.
Councillor Gulson.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Yeah, speaking to the tax increase also, and I supported those lower tax increases in the last couple of years also. I think those years are certainly different than what we're coming into now. With the coming out of COVID, the economic atmosphere is going to be very positive, I believe, and I hope. And I think the years where we were low was when it was real negative for everyone. And I think keeping the taxes at that rate certainly was the right thing to do at the time. I do believe we will have to have a bit of a catch up also. I'm not sure of the 5.5%, but certainly some catch up to make up the difference for previous years. But I think economically, the city will be hopefully in a really good position as far as the whole community and able to sustain that.
Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So every year we do studies, whether the results end up worthy information or not is always debatable, but obviously there should be some focus on the process of starting to isolate or engineering pertaining to the area of the water loss. Is that in the budget to start that process, or is that something more that has to be directed to, like, at least to start identifying the problems and how and where to address them?
So we do have some plans in place, and we are soliciting a proposal, I believe, for council's review from our engineers. That, however, would be considered separately from the tax rate itself, because water and sewer utilities, which will fund that sort of analysis, are actually funded through user fees. Charges. They would be something considered separately. Yes, they are.
Just going to ask one here for clarification and get the councillors in comparison. The lease revenue that's identified as being due of $60,000 per year, is that for the single location?
Yes.
Because I see down on the expenses, there's a positive of $35,000. That recognizes an overall need of $95,000 per annum. That's. Sure. And out of that $95,000, we're going to be putting $50,000 away as identified in the demo area at the PRL building. Is that?
That's the proposal. So the lease that you executed would be the responsibility of the tenant. Utilities. So currently we do $35,000. Separately. $50,000 increased expenses is a recommendation that administration has that says essentially don't allow that lease revenue to just go in general revenue or so for the first few years at least until we have saved enough money to cover the anticipated demolition costs. Our recommendation is to transfer the majority, over half of savings and increased revenue into a reclamation reserve so that you're in a position to execute that demolition should it's terminated.
Fair enough. I guess all that I'm getting at is it's perfectly logical, some of these things that we're doing as far as the road reserve increase and this increase. However, to have them all converge into a single year and be implemented in 1 year and result in a single increase that is in excess of the sum total of the previous 3 years is going to be a hard sell to the public. Which comes to shove it all boils down to dollars and cents. I get it. I think that some of these programs might have to have the brakes on for a little longer to bring this down to a more palatable number. Not denying the logic that went into the vast majority of them. I just think that to implement them all in the same year is going to be a very tough sell. So I think we're going to have to come up with some alternatives to try and reduce that a bit. I don't think that any reasonable person would expect the 0.8% increase to be a long-term annual change. It would be wishful thinking. However, one that is 6.5% is at the far opposite end of that scale, and I think we've got to come up with a reasonable compromise. Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Yeah, actually, that was one of my points as well. As I was a bit surprised at that because I don't remember having that discussion, maybe sort of informally, but we hadn't set a number. And I do think that that's probably a bit, personally, I think that's a bit ambitious to be setting aside that sort of money for the PLR. Again, just because it's compounding a lot of expenses like immediately here, and we're looking at this huge number, which is, I would agree, is completely unpalatable. So just so that I'm clear, administration is presenting 5.53 as if we change nothing, this is what's going to be required. And what we're being asked is either is that acceptable or an alternate number. Our policy would say that our goal should be the CPI number, which is 2.7. Is that correct? So that is quite a bit different. I guess also I have definitely been one to push for low numbers in the past because I really think that our community probably needed that. But I do appreciate the presentation that was done earlier. It's certainly in line with things that I've been reading from other sources as well. Nobody ever likes to bring, you know, an increase of you know, 2 point something or other percent forward to ratepayers, but I think that this year is probably the year that we have to start, you know, going back to our policy. And I guess I would like to see us use that as our target to go back to following policy as far as giving that guidance. But I do realize that that's going to be, to achieve that, that's going to require some significant, you know, number crunching. So I guess I'd like to hear what the rest of council thinks about aiming for CPI.
Councillor Jacobson.
Using that previous methodology of calculating revenue, as I recall, there was about $1 million that was on the table. Is that correct?
I believe the differential is approximately $250,000 per year ongoing revenue, depending on that. So since it 1 year, would be about $250,000. have been up $2 million. And we continue that.
So that's not, there's no catch-up reflected in this, correct? This is just using different methodology.
This is using the correct
Yeah.
policy.
Exactly.
You got it?
Councillor Hibbs, question. Administration has presented this number, I would say, as an upper limit and trying to anticipate some of the increased expenses and corresponding revenues that we can reasonably expect. It is, I'm clear, it's not our proposal that you forge ahead.
I get it.
I think that. I think it would be unhelpful. Our goal was to demonstrate, really do need to look at that CPI number and take that into account. Recommend that policy adherence, or even with a little bit of a catch up, an extra quarter point to look at something to 2.5 or 3.5 number, I think is very cheap. With that big growth and the supplementary assessment, I think you could likely bring that in.
Councilor Jacobson, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so I just, Councilor Hibbs had asked for some consensus. I do support CPI, so 2.7% is what we're shooting for here. Certainly not anything lower than that. And, yeah, I guess I was one of two who saw this, but I definitely do not support anything less than that or should.
Councilor Ross?
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. We increased taxes like the chart says to 4.6, a difference of 1.2 if we would have followed CPI. I go back to the policy, we're at 2.7 and a long-term plan of the road tax of 1%, focusing on roads and sidewalks. That's something you can kind of be consistent with. I think like there's 3.7. I guess that's where you have to explain to everybody that it is catch up, that CPI was, we were under, as initially try to be CPI, and situations change your direction. That was compassion, I think, to the community when the last couple of years, I think we were thinking with some compassion rather than, anyways, 2.7 plus 1 is 3.7. I guess to start some direction on a number. It's for the August and tomorrow.
Councillor Hookshire.
Maybe I'm the only one that is staring at this and I still can't grasp the 1%. So the 1% is at the top and it's at the bottom, but yet you're still saying that we have to add another 1% for paving. So, and so when Councillor Ross suggests 3.7, there's that 1% over 2.7. Why do I just keep tripping over this paving tax that it's represented in revenues and expenses as contribution to the road reserve, but yet you answered Councillor Jacobson that it'll still be an added 1%. So when we propose 3.7%, is that still including 150 to the roads reserve? I don't know, help me out here. I need to be Joe Citizen, that this doesn't make sense to me.
Billy?
So I believe that I liked the way that Councillor Ross put it, of 2.7 plus 1. The reason that it's showing up in the revenue is that you are actually going to levy a special paving tax with 1% general tax. That's something new that's been placed on someone with a total tax. It's a totally new tax. So they are going to see an increase. If you look at it as $150,000, you're approximately going to get $10 per capita. That's the recommendation, sorry. NGA's requirement is that that money be used for paving. If it's not for paving, it must be done. because of the way that the city conducts capital projects, typically they're $500,000, $1 million projects. And so 150,000 is the way to budget for it, is they raise it from the special paving tax, immediately put it into your roads reserve, and then you're doing paving contracts. So it comes in through the special paving tax, goes into a reserve, and then periodically, you're gonna pull that money out for special roads projects. But it is, as a homeowner, your municipal tax requisition is going up by 2.7%. But you're also including this new tax of 1%. So I'm actually seeing an increase of 3.7. And then confusingly, there will also be an impact from some provincial requisition and stuff that may raise with one of those. But the net impact to someone being taxed would be an increase of whatever your municipal increase is, plus a special paving tax.
You calculate 830,000 and that's 5.53%. And that includes that transfer to the road reserve. So to me, this is really then, like, we should pull that 150,000 out of there. So that we're not making it 6.53. 5.53 includes that.
It does, but it's pulled 150,000 out, that actually makes it worse, but that's kind of.
Right, so
Sure.
really, if you were to pull it out, like, this is the first year we propose a special paving tax. Now that I'm experiencing this, I would actually have a separate table
Thank you.
that said municipal revenues,
Right.
municipal expenses, and listed everything here except for the special paving tax. And then over here, I would have another column that would say special taxes. Paving tax, and then here's what it's used for as a contribution. Then you have a tax increase over here of 5.53, a special tax increase of 1%. That's probably.
But that math isn't correct.
The reason,
No,
the way we should have done is probably to take out the special paving tax and the revenues result. So, and have the expenses reflected through the expense, and then the total amount would be 6.53. And 1% of that would be designated as a special paving tax.
but
So it's because we put it in both and neutralized it, not showing as bottom line percentage increase.
so if you just removed the special paving tax entirely, like all references to it, so the special paving tax and the increased contribution of North Reserve, your 830,000 remains the same. What I think Councilor Jacobson was pointing out is that really that unfairly buries the fact that you have also this additional 1% that someone's facing that's reflected. So again, I apologize. Future will show us two separate.
Well, I think that it could have been perhaps a little clearer.
Just-
I wouldn't necessarily say this is for, you'd said the average taxpayer to appreciate this stage, because this is just for pre-approval of the amounts. I think in as much as franchise fee increase, that's going to have an impact.
Right.
Certainly to the vast majority of our citizens as well.
Right.
It's just coming through a little different stream.
Yes.
There's no question about it, but the overall impact is still a 5.3 plus the special paving tax and the franchise fees in a roundabout way. So it's still, I mean, the impact is still there
Right.
on each and every household. Right. Each and every account. Councilor Khan.
Okay, great. So just a quick question, CEO Gowdy. So that 2.7% COLA, so are you suggesting that the CPI has to correspond to COLA, or can it be two different numbers?
You have varied in the past. For example, last year, I believe it was 1% for tax rate. Sorry, 2 years ago, it was 1% for tax rate, 0.9% for COLA, 0.8% for the tax rate in 2020, and 0% for COLA. However, policies state to they should be the same, based on the same.
No, I was just gonna I'm not saying there shouldn't be a COLA, but I was gonna say this, I'm gonna be at the little higher end here. I think we should do a 3% tax increase plus the 1%, but then only do a 2% COLA. I don't know. But that's, and I'd have to leave in 5 minutes to increase this, so see me, that's where that's right. Thank you.
Get that, Councilor Potok? Yeah, there's certainly we have that maybe set a policy with that,
No,
say that we can adjust those two numbers, and I think that I rather doubt if there's anybody in this room that wouldn't suggest that our employees are deserving of it. However, to went from or where we're at over the past 3 years, and then to automatically back to full board. We might have to ease into it a little bit, but personally, I would like to see some sort of a number there. Increase, whether or not it's necessarily as high as CPI. I think that might be a little difficult to attain. Councilor Hoekstra?
Thank you. Now that my brain has got that figured out, I can ask other questions. But Dan, if we don't keep up with CPI or the COLA, does that market adjustment line get bigger and bigger each year? So in a way, we're kind of, we pay it one way or the other in adjustments.
It's kind of a difficult one to say because we don't necessarily know precisely what other communities that are their comparators will do. But this certainly has a way of keeping theoretically a year or two behind in that 50, or in that median. But I wouldn't say it's a necessarily one or the other or else. I mean, theoretically, I suppose if some other communities chose to lower theirs, highly unlikely, but I suppose it could happen. So I don't think it's quite that easy of an answer question. Chief County?
Yeah, that's going to be my point too. That really you're using CPI, you're looking at the cost of that. Desire is to be competitive, with similar employers. So you're actually using the CPI as a convenient proxy for an estimate, to estimate what everyone else is going to do. If they all decide 1%, even though CPI is 5%, well, if you do CPI, actually going off the mark, the better thing to do would be to determine what everyone else is going to offer for a COLA for their employees that year, some of which are published through bargaining agreements, some of which are you considering as you are now. That would be an ideal way to keep that wages. But it is just a periodic proxy, and since you go into salary surveys, policy every 2 years, it does catch up and it does take those things into account. So we compared the COLAs that had been offered to employees in comparative municipalities that have. They are slightly higher, and that's why you're seeing in a market adjustment that reflects a slight. As much as the number is large, some of the market adjustments that we faced in the past were huge. Going from 2.7 to 2, so Clark suggested, that doesn't give me fear and anxiety that we're going to face some uncorrectable thing in the future. Because there's an inclusion of correction here, I think many municipalities are going to face the same issue of inflation versus the cost of living offered to spend.
So we do have to give our administration direction here. My incorrect is suggesting that the 5.5 is not like, so we're interested in something closer to CPI for the purposes of formulating the next budget talks. Is that fair?
CPI plus the one, or no tax or CPI?
I think that we should probably consider those two separately.
No, I just was asking about, yeah. To support that.
So I guess just an indication then, the special road tax, in and of itself, the way that it's presented here, is that something that we want to go ahead with? I didn't hear anybody speak against it, so I think that's the direction we're going to get now. So then, as far as a number for an anticipated adjustment for pre-budget, do you want to stick with policy of CPI or? What's that?
2.7.
So we've had two that have suggested 3 and 3 that have suggested 2.7. Councilor Ross, I didn't see where you were at. Here where you were at.
I always say 3, because you can always go down.
So for the purposes today, then we'll go with CPI 2.71 plus 1%. Discuss them and see how that, that's just the numbers out for.
Just a question we had earlier, total electricity and gas budget for the city is approximately $1.4 million, $1.2 million related to electricity, $1 million to gas. That's an increase of approximately $90,000. 7%.
Thank you. And that's the reason why I wanted to bring that up. Councilor Ross, I believe you suggested that's, I mean, the number absolutely $100,000 is $100,000. It's significant, but our utility costs of the city are substantial. So it's still the bottom line. It's not nearly impactful if it were over a few $100,000. Great. Where are we at now? That's it.
Special paper tax. So
I did that already. So there's
what I did see at the COLA.
I believe with the numbers that we set forward, that was for you to figure out at this stage of the game. However, I think to expect matching COLA to CPI at this point in time is a little presumptuous. So we would like, yes.
Is that Chloe?
Upper limit of
Per
2.7.
page.
Thank you.
I think that everyone wants to see a cost of living adjustment. However, have it match. I think we need a little more of a ramped approach. Fair enough.
Yes, understood.
Right. I think that was all of the public formal information that we had for this evening. The next meetings that we'd have coming up all at 5 p.m. A regular council meeting on September 13th. And again, all 3 regular council meetings, September 13th, September 27th, and October 4th. All here in this room at 5 p.m. If you put those in your calendars, please. And I believe that we do have one camera item for discussion this evening. It's now 7 o'clock, so have a motion.